Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our first didactic session. We're going to do, mostly it's going to be Elizabeth's presentation on paradigms in developmental disabilities and looking at the different models and the way that people have been described and supported over the decades and the years. So the first thing I wanted to do was talk about what the definition of developmental disabilities is from this comes out of the Association on Community Living, which then has the Administration on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, which funds the USEDS and the LEN programs, and is funded or was mandated through the Developmental Disabilities Act. So you can see that the current definition looks at, it's a functional definition, so it's not based on categories of disability. So you have to meet kind of the definition through the functional definition of, combination of mental and physical impairments or mental and physical impairments, and it's likely to be result in substantial functional limitations. And you have to meet this in 3 or more of the following areas. So these are the areas of that are looked at: self-care, receptive and expressive language, learning, mobility, self-direction, for independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. So some of these, of course, like economic self-sufficiency and capacity for independent living would be looked at. You're always with the eye of what's the age, kind of what would be the expectations for a person of a certain age. So you wouldn't expect them to be independent living at 5 years old. But the definition in the next page talks about, sorry, it'll be the page after this, but and it also reflects the need for this combination of services over the lifespan and other forms of assistance. For children from birth through age 9, what we look at is they may not meet 3 or more of the criteria in those that were outlined above, but without the services and supports, they have a high probability of meeting these criteria later in life. So that's what how we look at it. It used to be, and Elizabeth will talk a little more about this, that we had certain categories of disability. Like I remember at one point it was you were found to have a developmental disability if you had epilepsy, an intellectual disability, what was the other ones, Elizabeth? I can't remember now. There was a couple of autism, and there was one more. There were four, I can't think of the fourth one, but that's the only 4 that would qualify you for services as a child or an adult with developmental disabilities. So Elizabeth Janks is our Associate Director for Community Living Programs, and she is, how long have you been here at DDI, Elizabeth?
22 years.
22 years.
Yeah.
So she has a lot of experience in running programs in the fields of family support, emergency preparedness, and a whole bunch of other things. So Elizabeth, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Ann. Appreciate that. And good afternoon to everyone. We're very excited to bring you the first in our lecture series for the MI-LEND, and we'll conclude around 7 p.m. As Michael stated earlier, you'll be able to ask questions throughout the presentation. As a presenter, though, if I feel like we're starting to get maybe off the learner objectives too far, then what we'll do is save them till the very end, or we'll do like a parking lot, what we call in the training world, where you'll write your questions down and then we can email each other if we have to sign off at exactly 7 p.m. So the learner objectives for this 2-part lecture is the learner will define the 3 paradigms of the field of developmental disabilities, identify a key principle of each paradigm, define one outcome of the ecological perspective in the intellectual and developmental disability field, describe how the paradigm impacts people with disabilities, define 3 goals of the community membership paradigm. So when we conclude the lecture tonight, everybody on the webinar should be able to know those learner objectives. I'm going to start with the medical model tonight. And I know that in preparation of this, many of you reviewed Parallels in Time, which is a wonderful, comprehensive, historical view of people with disabilities, how they've been treated throughout history, in literature, in art, obviously in society. And so in the interest of time, I know that you've completed that part of it. My lecture is going to pick up around the 1850s. Sometimes I'm going to drift a little before that, but this era is really the 1800s to the 1950s. Was really what we called the great era, not great, but it was the era of institutions and large institutions. So my lecture tonight will primarily focus on the medical model, the era of large institutions. We're going to go through the developmental model, and then finally where we're at today, which is the community membership model, and moving forward. Parallels in Time, I think, is a wonderfully comprehensive view of the historical perspective, and you may recall the warehousing of individuals in initially what were called almshouses or poor houses. These were really the very first institutions where people who were abandoned by family members, were isolated and ostracized in their families or in community, were brought to, and they were put in with criminals. They were put in with people with mental health disabilities. So it was a very sad situation. And from that model, though, kind of the institutional model grew from that. Wealthy families in this era would tend to keep their family members at home and support them there. You didn't see people with disabilities very often out in communities. They were often hidden away and not participating in communities. The exception being, families who had farms or in rural situation where that person might have a little job on the farm or with the family. This was the time of warning out and abandonment of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. This was a term that I'm sure you saw in Parallels of Time, where if your community didn't want you anymore, you were put maybe in a little cart or on the next wagon that came through town, and you were shuffled on to the next community and dumped off, and been just left there to languish oftentimes. This brings us up to, this became a huge societal problem, obviously. People were fearful of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, as they often are, of people that they don't understand. Dorothea Dix, of course, a historical figure, a great humanitarian, one of the early nurses, fought for legislation in 1848. She did not directly lobby Congress because women didn't do that at that time, but indirectly the first law was passed for preserving land with the intention of specifically being homes for people with disabilities. Now, it was a great concept at the time, everyone thought, that it was a humanitarian thing to provide a safe environment for these individuals. But you're going to learn tonight and throughout the course of the lecture how sometimes our well-intentioned ideas, things change, society change, economics change, and then things evolve in a way that are detrimental to the idea that we actually originally founded. So I'm going to take you to maybe more of one of the earlier evidence-based practices that emerged during this era. And it occurs in France. A French boy is found living in the wood around 1790s. He's found by people in the community and brought in, and a local physician to examine him and determine he is not deaf, but yet he does not speak. He's institutionalized, and he makes very little progress while he's in the community institution. He remains uncommunicative, has behavior issues, and so on. Until one day Dr. Janitard is making his rounds, and he sees this young boy who is abandoned by his family and names him Victor of Aveyron. And this boy lived between 1788 and 1828. Dr. Janitard worked on vocabulary and word recognition with Victor, and he begins to progress. And of course, he's wealthy, he has housekeepers, and he teaches them how to do this like early flashcard method to teach Victor some language. And it really is the very first time Victor does progress. And he learns some everyday living skills. And he does stay with the doctor and his housekeeper the rest of his life. But most importantly, I think for tonight, we need to examine the idea that this initiates one of the very first evidence-based practices in the field that people can learn. And it also kind of starts another concept that that people shouldn't be warehoused. It kind of changes from this custodial care idea of just being cared for to that people can actually learn and progress throughout their life. Now, around 1859, Dr. Charles Darwin writes a book on the origin of species by means of natural selection and focuses on the theory of evolution through natural selection. He later regretted using the term. He preferred the term natural preservation. And he believed that evolution occurred by a natural selection process. He was actually, he was actually a doctor as well as a geologist, and his theory really had little or nothing to do with the whole phrase survival of the fittest. This came from a gentleman named Herbert Spencer, and Spencer's belief that the social order was governed by survival of the fittest, which was sort of his theory, and a departure from what was originally intended by Darwin, is what actually stuck in society at the time. So this popular belief in society emerges that only superior specimens or people without disabilities or diseases should evolve. And it made a disability something that was to be a negative in society and to be shunned. Disability was viewed as a weakness and a deficit, and this is one of the factors that led to institutions and a hiding away of children and adults with disabilities. This belief also justified forced sterilizations, marriage restrictions, and as I said earlier, the warehousing of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Of course, these are just various factors that were going on in this era of eugenics, and was all a part of the medical model. So the medical model was an era where the belief was there was something wrong with the individual. The disability was a sickness to be cured, that it was a deficit, and it was primarily treated, IDD was primarily treated as an illness. Physicians of this era and all the way into the 60s and early 70s told parents to put their children in institutions because of a lack of options. This was an era before there were services available. The school of thought was you have no support system in place. You have other children. You have a family that needs to move forward from this. And so, again, it was well-intentioned and based primarily on the fact that there were no supports in communities. In this era, and again, I'm not a physician, and so I'm just going to touch very lightly on this, and I know in future lectures some of our physicians will talk more about this. But pain management in this area did contribute to social isolation. People had iron lungs and things that required them to go to facilities to receive treatment. If seizure and pain management resulted in less educational and social opportunities because medications of that era that controlled epilepsy were things like phenobarbital, which really sedates young children and kind of allows them to sleep through some of the times when they would be experiencing developmental opportunity. Of course, in the institutions as the populations grew, medications were given to keep people sedated and quiet and easier to manage. Around this time of the late 60s, around the time of the late 60s, we had about 200,000 people living in institutions. Medical directors of the institutions struggled with operating the facilities and doing the day-to-day management of the facility. the populations were burgeoning, and there was little time for nurturing, independent living skills, education, and social skill development for the residents, as there were less and less staff to care for more residents, and as facilities aged and needed to be cared for. To make things worse, it seemed to be a good idea to develop the colony plan, which isolated people with disabilities by categories. So if you were deaf, you stayed in the unit with all the deaf folks. If you didn't speak, you were in the unit with all the people who didn't speak. Now, I didn't tell you this about myself, but I'm a parent to a young man who has intellectual and developmental disabilities. And for me personally, this colony plan frightened me the most, because even today in our group homes that are well respected and are run by respected providers, they still use a mini version of this colony plan. And one of the reasons is economy of scales. It's cheaper and easier to just staff people who all serve a person with a type of disability. And this concept, so antiquated, goes all the way back to this medical model. And of course, I'm not going to get into all the problems here. We have a limited time tonight. But obviously, you can think this through, that if no one talks on a unit, who reports abuse or that they didn't get food? So you can see how problematic this was. Someone had a very interesting idea at this time also. Why not start farm colonies where people could participate in tasks and grow vegetables and operate farms? And this was an idea to move people with IDD out of the overcrowded institutions onto these farms. So I'd like to show you, at this moment, I'd like to show you one of the very first little DVD clips. This is a little DVD on Willowbrook, one of the large-scale New York institutions. It's about 2 minutes in length.
Well, I visited the state institutions for the mentally retarded, and I think particularly at Willowbrook that we have a situation that borders on a snake pit, and that the children live in filth, that many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because lack of attention, lack of imagination, lack of adequate manpower. There's very little future for the children or for those who are in these institutions. Both need a tremendous overhauling. I'm not saying that those who are the attendants there or the ones that run the institution are at fault. I think all of us are at fault. And I think it's just it's long overdue that something be done about it.
It's been more than 6 years since Robert Kennedy walked out of one of the wards here at Willowbrook and told newsmen of the horror he'd seen inside. He pleaded then for an overhaul of a system that allowed retarded children to live in a snake pit. But that was way back in 1965, and somehow we'd all forgotten. I first heard of this big place with the pretty sounding name because of a call I received from a member of the Willowbrook staff, a Dr. Michael Wilkins. The doctor told me he'd just been fired because he'd been urging parents with children in one of the buildings, building number 6, to organize so they could more effectively demand improved conditions for their children. The doctor invited me to see the conditions he was talking about, so unannounced and unexpected by the school administration, we toured building number 6. The doctor had warned me that it would be bad. It was horrible. There was one attendant for perhaps 50 severely and profoundly retarded children, lying on the floor naked and smeared with their own feces. They were making a pitiful sound, a kind of mournful wail that it's impossible for me to forget. This is what it looked like, this is what it sounded like, but how can I tell you about the way it smelled? It smelled of filth, it smelled of disease, and it smelled of death. We've just seen something that's probably the most horrible thing I've ever seen in my life. Is that typical of ward life?
Yes, there are 5,300 patients at Willowbrook, which is the largest institution for the mentally retarded in the world. The ones that we saw were the most severely and profoundly retarded. There are thousands there like that, not going to school, sitting on the ward all day, not being talked to by anyone.
So you can see that the exposure from the media, you know, was beginning. And there were several other things that happened that brought to light the deplorable conditions that people were experiencing in the institution. Of course, there's many wonderful advocates I could name, but Burton Blatt is one of the most recognized. He was a professor at Syracuse University, Dean of Education. He wrote many scholarly papers on intellectual and developmental disabilities, and one of his most famous books was co-authored by Fred Kaplan. It's called Christmas in Purgatory, and the pictures you've seen throughout the presentation are from that book. Look Magazine found the book as well and was connected to him, and they did an expose which led millions of Americans to see what was going on in the institutions. And of course, Geraldo Rivera, and I say in my PowerPoint, yes, the same one, it is, was starting his career out, and he was hungry for a good story and willing to take the risks to bring national attention to this. And of course, then there were the Kennedys, the entire family's influence on the deinstitutionalization process. This is a quote from President John F. Kennedy, and he, of course, was a family member. He had a sister, Rosemary, who had an intellectual disability, and he was driven to begin a panel of experts around the area of what they called then, I don't like to use the word today, mental retardation, but in the correct historical concept of this, it was the President's Panel on Mental Retardation. Of course, today we no longer use this word, but that was the correct word to use in that era. So the panel convenes in 1961. The report concludes in 1963, and it concluded a vast need for family support programs that would support families with respite, resources. It identified training to professionals and to families as being important. Education, and this is where we all kind of come in, is the need for interdisciplinary student education, pre-service, master's level, doctoral in the field as well. And then, of course, more research in the field to advance evidence-based practices. Another interesting thing is there were people on the panel who were family members as well, and there was a need finally identified to involve people with disabilities and their family members in the entire process. And this was a very new concept in that time. Because of that report and because of that work, USIDs were born, AUCDs, of course, which is what MI-LEND and, of course, the Michigan Developmental Disabilities Institute, we're a university center in educational excellence in developmental disability. We came directly out of this report, and then lobbying to Congress to put money behind supporting the development of university centers. DD councils, every state has a developmental disability councils. This is another this was another initiative funded through this committee. The protection and advocacy system as well. So with the systems in place, we began the creation of a new paradigm. And as in any time when there's a shift, right, in thought or philosophies, there's several different kinds of things that have to come. There's a synergy that builds, and so there has to be systemic change, there has to be policy change, there has to be advocates, there has to be a belief by society that we need to make these changes. And so that is what happened as we began the new era. There was the idea that there was abuse at many institutions, and it was recognized. There were grassroots efforts by family members. There were lawsuits against the institutions that families won. There was negative publicity in the media, and the people who came out of the institution spoke up about the atrocities that occurred there. Due to the advocacy and the panel recommendations and many of the other things previously mentioned, Congress, and it was lobbied to begin legislation that would support community services for people with disabilities. The Community Mental Health Act was passed in 1963. That is the act that funded all community mental health services in our country, and now in Michigan funds our PIHPs. And Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is passed of 1975. Before this, there was no mandated special education for people, young children with disabilities. So this was like hugely important. Each district could decide whether they wanted to, teach students with disabilities or not. There were programs that had students with disabilities, but there were many others. So children languished in their homes or were dependent on their families to teach them. The Rehab Act of 1973, specifically sections 501 and 505, talked about there could no longer be discrimination of federal employers of people with disabilities. So this legislation, and there were others, but these are kind of the cornerstones, led to community-based opportunities for people. But there were some drawbacks to the developmental model, okay? It was very much built on the psychology of that era, which, of course, in the teaching of that era, which was around task analysis and around the promotion of mastering daily living skills. So it was a little bit like when you teach a child, but we were teaching adults in these things. And there was a belief that, you could achieve these steps, like you could feed yourself, and then you would start with, maybe toilet training, then feeding yourself, dressing yourself, and so on. The problem was if you couldn't get to the next step, maybe you had a physical difficulty or whatever, you couldn't go on. And so people stayed on the same skill for months and months. And I'll give you like an example. So if you were working on dressing yourself and you couldn't raise a zipper and you didn't have the gross motor skills or fine motor skills to snap a snap, you might practice that for weeks or months, okay? And nobody maybe thought about putting elastic waist pants on somebody and letting them go off to community or whatever that might be. This is an era where learning was done in artificial environments, day programs, schools. People with intellectual disabilities, research now supports that they learn best in the real environment where they're going to actually manipulate and replicate the skill. Professionals administered programs, all right? Social workers, psychologists, physicians, special educators, and they were in charge of the programs. There was very little input by the actual children and adults with disabilities. This is the era of assessment, treatment plans, and goals. My career, I started in this era, and I can remember, as I'm sure many of you can who are listening, sitting around a table and the psychologist was there, maybe the psychiatrist, the social worker, possibly a nurse, and we did the treatment plan for a year. And the person with the disability wasn't even in the room. So you can imagine a lot of the goals were things like Joe needs to lose 10 pounds. Joe needs to quit cracking his knuckles. Joe needs to stop smoking, or Joe needs to stop swearing. So they weren't goals that maybe as an individual you would want to put, down for yourself as goals to help yourself become more self-determined and to achieve things. The idea, though, behind this behaviorism also was that new behaviors could be learned, and that's a positive, right? And so, of course, the reward token system we use. But as I said earlier, skills were learned in isolations and didn't transfer to community. And so we had to rethink this and think about how people could come out of these educational, opportunities and into real outcomes for themselves. So it was the idea behind this and the way we're educating people was really an attempt to make people acceptable to mainstream society at the time. And because remember, people with disabilities were not widely seen in our communities during the medical era or the institution era. And so people had grown up and never seen people with intellectual, developmental, or physical disabilities. So the concept that is behind the behaviorism was to teach people skills to make them more acceptable to society and less feared. This is the era of large group homes. Again, I remember I started one of my jobs in Texas, right? 38-bed facility. Oh, we thought this was progress. I now look back and I realize it was really a mini institution. But this was how it was, and they were often on what we would call the other side of the tracks. This is before legislation passed, and neighborhoods could say, I don't want this group home in my area. Go to their city councils, and it wouldn't happen. So again, people were marginalized in the poor parts of town and segregated. And there was no special ed, right, until 1975, so people were kept in their homes. So the lack of planning for this paradigm created problems. However, oftentimes when there are shifts in paradigms and a shift in society's thinking, there isn't time to make a plan. We do the best we can, right? But finally, we begin to see the end of the institutional era. Okay, let's see. We're going to go to normalization, the ecological theory and inclusion. This concept of normalization, of all the concepts that could have been selected, why is this one so important? It's very important. Of course, it came from Wolfensberger, a professor, Syracuse University, and the entire theory was that people with IDD could become parts of communities. They could be taught the skills that were necessary to make them a part of a viable society and an accepting community. If you've never been or worked in an institution, you may not realize that people learn institutionalized behaviors when they live in these types of environments. They're not given choices. They wear hand-me-downs that people donate to the institution. It's not fashionable. They've learned skills that might not be considered, up to societal standards. They haven't had the opportunities to learn these skills in an isolated environment. And so Wolfensberger's research was around, how can we help people, become part of their community? And this concept of normalization is what he coined. And today this word is offensive to some people because some people with disabilities feel like why do we have to become normal? Our disability makes us unique, and we don't need to normalize to a standard. Which kind of led to the evolution of social role valorization, maybe a little softer way of terming normalization, and basically, again, teaching people how to be a part of society, giving them opportunities to practice their new skills in real environments. And what I'm going to do is I'd like to show you another video clip that is kind of humorous, but I think that it demonstrates how people can teach someone who has a disability, or anyone else for that matter, a skill by practicing it and giving them an opportunity.
Oh, you're here. Sit in this, put this on. Your brother's going to seduce you. Really? You're not going to resist that at all? It's nice to feel wanted. JJ, your date is here.
Oh, you look nice. Thanks. You look nice, too. Oh, confident. Ah, so she has to be right next to you.
Yes, stay in character. And you're watching the movie. You had me at hello. Claire is eating her olives.
I don't like olives.
Claire does. Eat the olives.
And Claire goes to the bathroom. Pit stop! And Claire.
Dude, where were you?
I actually had to go.
Okay, movie's about over. This is the time when Claire's gonna give you that look.
What look?
The look that says, Kenneth, please take me to your hot tub. And you know what to do when she gives you that look, right?
Ugh. You get the idea.
We are go.
Coffee.
What is that?
Clear.
So smooth.
And that is how you do it, people. Well done.
Fantastic.
Brilliant.
Nice work.
Yes.
All that and you can't get me to a field trip on time?
I know it was, I don't know that Dr. Wolfensberger might have exactly approved of that, but I thought it was kind of a cute way of showing how we can do normalization, right? People just need to learn those skills in the same way that you and I learned how to go on our first date or what the cool kids were wearing or whatever that might be. So, you know, an awakening was beginning, and his book is called Citizen Advocacy. I would encourage people to read it. It's still a cornerstone in the field, and it really, you know, he and others were really beginning to pioneer this idea that we needed to move away from specialized programs, examining questions like, were programs and workshops translating to success for people? What do people need to live in communities? And really, this is the time when the journey from clienthood to community membership begins. And people began to think about quality of life. Around the same era, maybe a little bit later, in '79, we come across Yuri Bronfenbrenner's theory on the ecological perspective. And for many of you, you already know, so I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about this, but of course, it's the ecological perspective that looks at our life in layers. Looks at, we can do, it's an exercise in identifying who is a part of our life, what are the systems impacting our life, and how can we increase areas of our life to include other people or other systems so we can eradicate the barriers that oftentimes limit our potential. Ecological perspective, of course, huge in social work, which is, and it's in my background, but also influenced psychology, education, and was the kind of one of the advents that led to the psychosocial therapy versus the psychopathological model, which of course social therapy, a more positive way of providing therapy, whereas psychopathological approach looked at more of the deficits of a person and issues that were problematic. So I just want to put a quick slide up here about the different systems and how you would map something like this if you were going to use this. Some of us still use this to help people with developmental and intellectual disabilities increase what we call our circle of support, which we're going to talk more about in the second lecture tonight, which is the community membership model. Basically, you have the microsystem, that's the person. Then you have the mesosystem. Those are the people you come directly in contact with, daily or weekly. These would be like your family members, your friends, maybe your teachers, professors, and then the exosystem are the systems that impact your life, like wherever you go to university, or a PHIP that administrates your support coordination, or it could be your healthcare, your hospital, your physician. And then on the outer circle is, of course, what we would call the macro system, and these are the legislation and or policies that influence a person's life. And it's sort of like a trickle-down effect. How does the policy affect, the next, like the PHIP? How does that affect your supports coordinator, who then helps you build your person-centered plan? And we're going to, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit more about in the second lecture. But I think the important thing to remember about this, the mapping system, is that it's a great way to identify positive influences that are out there that you can access, and it's also a way to identify challenges and expand a circle. Research shows that the more people come in their lives, the more people they become involved in their lives, the more active they are in the various systems. It's shown that they're happier and they show better quality of life outcomes. And if you think about that, and that makes sense considering like people who are isolated obviously are restricted in their interactions, and that's how people become very depressed and I was isolated. So quality of life, it was decided that it should not be defined by professionals. It should be defined by the individual. And there was a keynote conference that was done in Sweden in 1970 where a white paper came out that was written by people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Many of the leaders of that time in the field were at this conference. It was one of the pivotal moments of an international movement that began inclusion and began this idea of a community membership model. Here's some of the things the advocates defined as their desires. They wanted to live independently. This comes directly from that white paper. We want to live independently. We want to learn to cook and to budget our own money. We don't want to be coddled. We want more interesting jobs. We demand the right to marry and have children. We want to be trained and educated for better work. The message was clear. People wanted to be free. They wanted dignity, and they wanted personal fulfillment. And if that sounds familiar to you, that's probably the same things that we all want as individuals as well. The field began to take note, and a holistic service system begins. Reducing barriers to inclusion, wraparound services start so that people can access the system at one point and receive multiple supports through that one port of entry. And then there was policy that supported the implementation of this process. Again, as I mentioned earlier, whenever a paradigm shift begins, there has to be legislation behind it to support the changes. And so here were some of the things that happened in that era, at the beginning of this era. The ADA was passed, the Americans with Disability Act in 1990, the Developmental Disabilities Act of 2000, which Ann talked about earlier, because not only does it talk about some of the most important things for usage and family support, it also identifies the eligibility requirements for people with disabilities. The Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, and National Institute of Health, Office of Special Education and Rehab Services, and foundations began funding exemplary programs and pilot projects through grants in this era. Program designs incorporated people with disabilities in every layer. This was becoming more common. And we do this here at our USED, and we always compensate our families or individuals with disabilities, as they should be, for providing their expertise. But of course, this wasn't always the case, so this was something new to the community membership model. Some of the tenets of the community membership model are this model doesn't allow for exclusion of anyone. It's accepting of all people. Any society that excludes one excludes all. And diversity is beautiful and enriches our lives. Community can and will evolve naturally if not forced. And maybe the next paradigm will not be needed. And I'd like to pose this question: why do you think that would be possible? Why do you think people would believe that we won't need another paradigm following the community membership model? And I'm just going to pose that to all our participants. And maybe what I can do is go to the next clip, which is Greta. She's part of our MI-DDI Possibilities series. And Greta, I chose her because Greta's lived in all of these three paradigms. She's lived through the medical model, she's lived through the developmental model, and she's living a full life in the community membership model. So if you folks want to think about questions or answer that question, we're going to go ahead though, and I'll entertain them after we do the video.
I guess we get this from my mom. She had always told us there is nothing in life that you can't do. Whatever you decide to do, persevere and you will be successful at it. I think Greta internalized that. Growing up with her, I saw that it didn't limit her enthusiasm and it didn't limit her drive and desire to excel past what her physical limitations were.
My mom and my sister taught me when I was small to do as much as you can for yourself.
First time I met her, I was very shocked because Lexa never told me Greta is disabled. So from what my conversation with Dr. Joshua is, she goes to work, and they travel together, and Greta apparently is very funny and telling jokes. So I did not know, I guess my perception of a disabled person is somewhat incorrect, as proved to, later to be.
Started working here with my sister, so I'm here 2 days a week. I'm hoping a mail that take out the lab to put all the lab together. I filled up the copying machine with paper.
She's very independent, a lot more independent than you would expect. I had to learn to allow her to take care of things for herself. Even if she struggled with it, she preferred to work it out.
She manages somehow. She manages where we'd be sitting and feeling sorry for ourselves. She just goes about business as usual.
Greta's probably more personable and gregarious than I am. You know, she loves being around people. I don't think Greta ever met a stranger. She will come up to you and say, "Hi, I'm Greta. What's your name?" I don't do that readily.
The patients just love having her here. She knows people. She talks to them. I bring them into the examining rooms, and she hears their voice, and she calls out, "Is that so-and-so?" And, you know, she recognizes their voice, and it just thrills people, you know. So I have a hard time getting them back to see a doctor because they always have to stop and talk to Greta first. She speaks her mind a lot. So that's why I'm fortunate, because she's just being herself. She's not being someone else. She's not, you know, hiding behind a facade. What you see is what you get.
She's so optimistic. Every time I see her, she's happy. There doesn't seem to be any down days for her. That's Greta.
We travel. I mean, we've been several places. We went to Costa Rica. We've been to Jamaica, Philadelphia several times. It's one of our favorite cities to go to. We've visited friends in Texas.
I've been to New York, and I love New York. My sister always told me that it's a beautiful place, but you can't really interfere until you be there yourself. Fed you at Times Square at night. Ooh, I love that.
The limiting factor for their frequent travel is Dr. Joshua herself, not the Greta. Because Joshua has a very busy practice, so she cannot just take off when she wants to.
I really believe in God. That's my number one. Go right there. Let the reader, I'm able to do so much because of God. Ain't nothing that I did on my own. It's the wisdom and knowledge of God.
One advice I would give is that don't hold anyone back and don't instill hopelessness. I would say that the greatest gift that you give someone is inspiration, that they are able to surpass what we see physically as their limitations, because the soul and the spirit inside of Greta is just tantamount to the power that she mustered to overcome her physical disability on a daily basis.
The relationship between two sisters and the support that Dr. Alexa Joshua was able to provide for Greta, I think that's very important for Greta to be successful and to live her life to the fullest.
She supported me when I was going to school emotionally, and would come home and when I thought about complaining, I look at Greta and say, well, I can't complain. She has to deal with, cerebral palsy every day, and I'm complaining because I'm up all night studying. She would look and say, don't worry, you can get through it, just keep going. So I think because I realized the difficulty she had and she realized the difficulty that I was having, that sort of solidified the bond that was already there.
One time I made a comment that to Dr. Joshua, I said, well, Greta is very lucky to have you. But Alexa said to me, yeah, I'm lucky to have her too.
What came to mind was a photograph that we have that she's standing behind me against the fence and I'm standing in front of her. Now, if you didn't know that, you would think that she was standing on her own, but actually she was leaning on me and I was leaning back, and so it was sort of supporting her from that point on. That's the way our relationship has been. supporting each other.
We're at the second part of the lecture tonight. So we're going to talk about the community membership paradigm we're in right now.
Elizabeth, can I interrupt you 1 second? We have an answer to your question coming from Ramsey.
Okay. Excellent.
He says there may not be a need for another paradigm shift due to the focus on inclusion and flexibility of the community orientation in meeting people's needs and allowing them to pursue their desires and goals.
That is very well stated, and that is the hope of all of us in the field, the advocates, family members, and individuals with disabilities, that there will be an acceptance of people and there won't be a need for us to provide any further specialized support services. People will get real jobs, people will get trained, people will set goals, be self-determined, and lead their lives much as most people want to do. So thank you. I don't know who answered that one, but there's a great answer. Ramsey, great answer. We're going to kind of go ahead and I like this idea of folks just, if you feel comfortable, pose your questions, and Michael will facilitate that interaction with me. So please feel free to do that. So this is the community membership model. It evolved after the medical model and the developmental model. As the previous slide stated, it began around the late 80s, early 90s. It really puts the emphasis on the person. And some of the concepts around that would be, you know, people dictating their needs and wants, money following the person. We're not quite there yet, but we're hoping to get there. People with disabilities driving their desires, setting goals. And we're going to talk about the person-centered planning process, which is how we get there, how we set these goals and attain these goals. It embraces a high quality of life for people, not marginalized in poor housing, not taking low-paying jobs in custodial positions, but we want people to have a high quality of life, whatever that is that they want for themselves. The view is in this model that people are not ill, that disability is to be embraced, and promotes a quality of life and an acceptance of all of us. If you ever get a chance to see a gentleman named Norman Kuntz, he's a wonderful speaker, and there wasn't time tonight to actually show one of his great works that he has done. It's called Cradle for Support, and I'm going to send out, Ann is going to be sending out some links to some of these little clips that we're putting out. But anyway, Norman is a person with a disability, a physical disability. And he said, a person in the audience asked him, would you take away your disability if you could? Would you? And he said no. And that surprised me a little bit. But he went on to explain, he said, you know, this was many years ago, he went on to explain that his disability makes him who he is. He may not have gone on to his life's work without his disability. And if you ever get an opportunity to see Norm, I don't think he travels as much as he used to, but there's a lot of his stuff on the web, and it's very worthwhile viewing.
We'll put, you know, we can put Credo for Support maybe up, and then with his name. Okay.
And saying we're going to put Credo for Support up by Norman Kuntz. So
Elizabeth, I have another question for you.
What would it be, Mike?
Michael asks, what does money follows the person mean? I have not heard this before.
That means that instead of Social Security sending a check to someone and directly, they get to, well, maybe that's not the best example, okay? Maybe the best example of this would be someone utilizes community mental health services, right? And they have a budget. And they're allowed to purchase so many hours of a direct care worker's time. Right now, the way this model works in our system is the community mental health system, or the PHPs, have the money and it goes into a budget for the individual with a disability. The individual with the disability doesn't get the check, and so therefore they don't get to customize those services exactly the way they want to, because they have to be beholden to the way that system does their financial billing, all of that goes with it. And so in an ideal model, what many of us would like to see is money follow the person, where the person would get the funding and then be able to dictate exactly how they would get to use it versus going through a system. Now, there are other countries that actually do this. They tend to be countries where there are not very many people who have disabilities, but we are working towards that. Hopefully that would be one of our evidence-based practices that we would want to see evolve from this model. These are some of the other evidence-based practices of this model. Teaching people with disabilities their advocacy skills so they can speak out for themselves. Those who can't, or for families, utilizing an advocate is a very helpful way of getting what you want for an individual. Person-centered planning, of course, is a cornerstone. We're going to talk a lot more about that later in the lecture. Independent facilitation, self-advocacy, employment, meaningful jobs that result in a fair wage, and living in inclusive communities. Remember how I said we started in the institutions and then we went to these large group homes, and we're still in this group home era right now. And so eventually, wouldn't it be the goal to have people living in their own homes with a roommate if they wanted to, but to have the option to live the way we do? And just more options so people can live individualized lives, which would lead to the quality of life set by their standard. Advocates are just absolutely essential to people with disabilities getting what it is they need, because if you don't know how to ask for something yourself, you need someone who can help you ask for it. There are trained advocates out there. There are many organizations that aren't necessarily disability specific that use advocates as well for the same reason we do, because it works. Like Social Security Administration has advocates. But these are some of the disability field agencies that have advocates that people with disabilities can call upon to help them get some of the results that they're hoping to. Michigan Protection and Advocacy Services Incorporated, which is our sister organization in the disability field of Michigan, United Cerebral Palsy of Michigan. I actually need to take MAF off. They do not employ advocates, but the ARCs do. Many of the ARCs have advocates in the various counties throughout Michigan. Advocates can be pretty much anyone. A professional can be an advocate for someone. An individual with a disability becomes a self-advocate. You're an advocate whenever you speak up for families or individuals that have disabilities. And it's really important that if people want to learn the advocacy skills, we need to be a part of that. Because once, you teach a person to fish, they can go out and get their own fish. They're not relying on us to cast the net. And so advocates, that's what the important role is, to make sure you mentor or provide someone with some education around the ability to speak up for themselves. And that's what self-advocacy is all about. The person represents themselves. They are usually learning to speak up in a cause that they believe in. They are taking action. They represent what you need or what they need to others. They never give up. They persevere until they get to a solution. And that's a part of being self-determined, which we're also going to talk a little bit later about in this lecture. So it's speaking up for yourself. Self-advocates learn their skills through training. They go to conferences. There's a lot of curriculum online that's available. A lot of disability-related organizations do advocacy training. And there's a lot of ways to access that. And there's a slide in here about some of the self-advocacy organizations that are very active right now. These are some of our more popular self-advocacy organizations right now. It's SABE, Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered, SAM, Self Advocates of Michigan, which I believe is one of our newer groups. It's going to be a very important self-advocacy network in our state. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, very important as well. ARCs have advocacies and self-advocacy education available, and also utilize individuals with disabilities as advocates. And also the Michigan Protection and Advocacy Incorporated as well. And some of these organizations feel very strongly, like SABE, feel very strongly about family members not calling themselves advocates. They believe that only individuals with disabilities should call themselves advocates. And they're I've been in rooms where there's been heated discussions around parents becoming advocates for their children. They really hold the philosophical belief that individuals with disabilities need to be empowered and self-determined to become their own advocates. Michigan Mental Health Code mandates person-centered planning. Person-centered planning is another evidence-based practice that is there to support community membership for people with disabilities. This is the way it's actually stated in the law. It's a process. I know that many of you listening know that it's like nails on a chalkboard when we hear that person-centered plans are documents or it's a program, okay? It's a process. It's a process of planning and supporting the individual receiving services that builds upon the individual's capacity to engage in activities that promote community life and that honors the individual's preferences, choices, and abilities. The person-centered planning process involves families, friends, and professionals as the individual desires or requires. It's only a paragraph, but it's a very important paragraph in the law. And a lot of people fought for many years to have it become part of the Michigan Mental Health Code. So some of the elements of good person-centered planning means that the individual decides the outcome for the meeting. They talk about who to invite into that circle. What are they going to talk about? They set goals and when and where to hold the meeting. They talk about, who should facilitate the meeting. And there's a pre-planning process as well. But I thought this would be a good place to bring in Michael Small. He's considered to be one of the fathers of person-centered planning, one of the leaders, and he's written books on the topic. He's definitely considered the person who's an expert in this area. So I'd like to bring up another clip. We only have 2 more, and this particular clip is 5 minutes, and it's Michael Small defining person-centered planning.
Michael, why is person-centered planning important?
If people are to have the lives that they want, when we're talking about people who are at risk of losing control or have lost control of their lives, if they're to have the lives they want, then they have to have something that says, here's what's important to me, here's how I want to be supported, here's how I want to live. And that's what a person-centered plan does. It provides a description of what's important to the person, how they want to live, and describes actions so that they get the life that they want.
And there are different styles of person-centered planning, aren't there? Say a bit about the different styles and where they are useful and powerful.
Each different style is powerful. Each different style of planning has a different power. And if you look at the main styles that are used, you would start with PATH. PATH is a remarkably powerful way of defining a destination, saying, here's how I want to live at some point in the future. And here's how we can mobilize people so that we can take the steps necessary to get there. MAPS, on the other hand, is really about how do I mobilize a circle that's around me. And a circle would be a group of committed people who are willing to kind of walk with me and be with me, and typically are mostly not paid. And MAPS is a way to mobilize that group and keep them mobilized and keep them committed, and to be able to, again, look at a desirable future. Both of those planning formats assume that there's a committed group of people, that there's a committed group of people who are willing to walk with you, be with you, and part of the process is to mobilize and commit those people in their work. Essential lifestyle planning, which is a third way of doing it, assumes that there are people who are knowledgeable who know the person, but doesn't assume that there's a committed group of people around the person. It says if we can gather the information that tells us what's important to you and how to best support you, then we can make it happen. Essential lifestyle planning was really designed to be done inside systems as well as outside. Path and maps were designed to be done on the edges of systems where you could find those committed groups of people.
I think people often get confused by all the terms that have person-centered at the beginning, and it'd be really good if we could just run through a few of those and get some definitions. So let's start with person-centered approaches, person-centered thinking, and person-centered planning. How do you define those when people ask you?
All of them have person-centered at the beginning, and it truly is just a normal use of language. It means the person's at the center of the effort. It's not the system that's at the center of the effort, it's not the program, it's not the agency, it's the person. So an approach that has people at the center would be person-centered. And any approach that would be used might be a strategy, it might be a policy, it might be a practice, but a person-centered approach is not a plan. Person-centered thinking, on the other hand, refers to a set of tools where you've taken approaches, you've taken ways of doing the work, you've taken the planning, and you've broken them down into pieces so that you have discrete tools that can be used to support a person. The core tool that we teach is being able to sort what's important to a person from what's important for. What's important to a person, what makes them happy, fulfilled, content, satisfied, comforted. What's important for health and safety and being a valued member of the community. And if you can do a good job of sorting that and describe the balance between them, then you've gone a long way towards being able to help the person get a life. But there's a whole set of other tools that go with that. The second most commonly used is working and not working. What is working for the person? What is not working for the person? And you do it from multiple perspectives. And it assists people in looking not only at how are we developing a way forward, but how is that way forward working? How do we need to adjust it? How do we need to take a look at it? There's a whole set of other tools that go with this and we teach 8 in the initial training, but there's easily 25 or 30 that skilled practitioners use.
So that's person-centered approaches and person-centered thinking. What about person-centered planning and person-centered descriptions? How do you describe those to people?
A person-centered description is a piece of a person-centered plan. And a great deal of the work that we're doing now, we're helping people get started by saying, let's work together, or let me show you how to work so that you can describe how you want to live, what's important to you, what does best support look like, what do other people really like and admire about you? And that would be a person-centered description. It's not a plan until it has actions associated with it.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Okay, so that was Michael Small, obviously talking a lot about person-centered planning and the various terminology associated with the person-centered planning process and approach. And, you know, I think he really does a wonderful job of explaining it. And I think if your takeaway is that the focus is on the person and their strengths, and how to build that support system around them so they can achieve some goals for themselves. I think that would be a very important area to focus on. And I know many of you as trainees, you're going to become professionals, or maybe you already are and you're working out in the field. So really understanding person-centered planning and that process behind it, knowing it exists, will help you as you work with people with disabilities. You can look at a plan. You can see what are this individual's goals? How can I support this person in that endeavor? So as future professionals, you're going to need to know some of this information so that you can work with that individual and help them, attain some of their goals. We always say everyone has a strength. you have to kind of get to know that person a little bit, but all people have strengths, and building on those strengths, as Michael Small reflected on, is key in building a plan. And secondary, of course, is, I think, the preferences that they identify. I shouldn't even say secondary. I think preferences are right up there as well. What does that person want for their life? It's not what I want for them. It is what they want for themselves. And sometimes families and people with disabilities don't agree necessarily on those preferences. So that's where it gets a little bit tricky sometimes. Sometimes we as professionals don't agree with those goals, right? But we have to let people take those risks and have those learning experiences, because that's how we grow.
Hey, Elizabeth, I have another response to your earlier question.
Okay, Michael.
Coming from Molly. She says, as mentioned, in the past, some people were never exposed to people with disabilities due to exclusion from society. I believe with inclusion of people with disabilities in everyday life, there will not need to be a new model, as inclusion of all people will become a new society norm.
Yeah, Molly, that's great. That's so true. You know, because we didn't have, a lot of us didn't have an exposure to people with disabilities, and now with more and more people living in our community, and we're getting acquainted with them, going to school with them, you'll be working with them as a future professional as well, and obviously the more we interact with people, whether they have a disability or not, right, we you know, accept. And with that, hopefully we won't need that next model. That is our hope. So thank you for sharing that. Going back to some person-centered planning thoughts here, there are some other key tenets to this. Planning results, the plan has to be documented in ways that are meaningful to people who have disabilities. If you go to some agencies and pull person-centered planning forms, you'll see that the goals are not sometimes very easy to understand. They don't identify the support people involved to reach that goal. And a person with a disability sometimes can't understand the documentation. So it's really important that we keep it simple, that they get a copy of the plan. And this next slide is going to talk about a little bit about some of the ways you can actually it's not the next slide, but there's some ways Michael Small referred to, like maps and path that utilize drawings and very few words. So when you're documenting a person-centered plan, you don't have all of the, you know, the words there. And for people with low literacy levels, the pictures in the drawing and can support the ideas behind the plan in a way that's easily understandable to them. So you have to keep that in mind as you're facilitating a plan. So here are some other things to consider. We need to focus on skills, strengths, and solutions, and not problems. We can't ignore problems in a person-centered plan, but it shouldn't be the focus of the plan. We have to respect the the person's values and opinions. This is key, building circles of support that can make the goals happen. We have to utilize, if you're a facilitator, you want to utilize open-ended questions. Would you like a job? Yes, no? No. What would you like to do out in a job? Okay, open-ended questions so they have an opportunity to, you know, really have a dialogue with the facilitator. We need to arrange a lot of learning opportunities for people. People sometimes have not had an exposure to things, and so, again, because of isolation and because of a lack of inclusive opportunities, they may have never tried some of the other things that, you know, some of us do take for granted. And we need to offer those opportunities to people. Finding meaning behavior is very important, and I have a slide that talks about people who don't communicate in a traditional way. We'll discuss that a little bit more. If you take responsibility to support a person, then it's important that the person-centered planning facilitator holds those people responsible to completing the tasks. Most of all, facilitators have to be flexible, creative, and collaborative as they move through the process. This pre-meeting agenda is what I believe he referred to as sort of the person-centered description piece. This is getting to know the person. So before you have the actual plan, it's important to have the pre-meeting. And this is where a good facilitator finds out, does this person use technology to communicate? How do they communicate best? What are their dreams? What are their fears? What are their strengths? Really getting to know that person. And sometimes people question, what is your dream? They might say, well, I want to be a teacher, or, you know, I want to be a doctor. And you might, people look around the room, and this will be a person who, you know, doesn't read or, you know, doesn't write perhaps, and a good facilitator kind of carves something from that is still meaningful to that person, you know, so that they're maybe guiding them in the process. Okay, like teaching, like showing people things. You know, have you thought about, you know, maybe working as maybe a paraprofessional or as an aide in a classroom? So there's ways to guide the process without debilitating people's dreams and making them realistic and attainable. And that's a very skilled facilitator that does that. And then some of these other things that I'm not going to get into with every bullet, but the most important thing to come away with is good person-centered plans just don't happen, okay? It takes a planning process and the opportunity to get to know the person. Sometimes people don't converse, sometimes people don't communicate traditionally. And things to know about people who don't use traditional communication is that sometimes their behaviors are their way they communicate. Just because I say this all the time, because my son Robert doesn't talk, and people sometimes say, oh, I bet your children never have ever argued. Well, no, that's not true at all. They argue, and just because Robert can't talk, he lets it be known to his siblings what it is he likes and he doesn't like. So you have to know, and they know when they're ticking him off too. So they know those behaviors, and they know what he's trying to tell them. And it's very important as we work with individuals with disabilities and those that do not speak, we have to learn that behavior is not them being non-compliant, which is a label we've used too often in our industry, but it's their way of communicating and understanding why is that person exhibiting that particular behavior at that moment. Are they frightened? Do they feel uncomfortable with the people in the room? You know, what are they trying to convey? And so reframing that behavior as communication, understanding why that behavior is being exhibited is very important. And also technology now is really supporting people. There's so much out there. People are working on it with iPads. There's all kinds of programs out there. People don't really need Dynavoxes any longer, which are very expensive tools. There's so much accessible computer technology now that it helps even the most, you know, people who are most challenged in using traditional communication devices. So I always ask, what, you know, do this individual use a communication device? What is it? How do they communicate? Whether it be a PEC system, which are pictures they point to a Dynavox, whatever that range might be. Because it's really key to understanding how they communicate so we can really work with them. Here's some things person-centered planning is not. They're not safety plans. You know, they're not, you know, ways of teaching people safety or evacuation procedures during a fire drill. They're not weight calorie reductions. They're not medication compliance plans. They're not a hygiene improvement program, and believe it or not, Ann and I are kind of smiling. We've both seen this on person-centered plans. They are not walking programs. We're not going to all go to the mall and walk around the mall, you know, with all the same people. When you pull and you monitor the quality of a plan, you want to look at, do people who all live together have the same plan? Because that's an indication that the plan is not individualized, but in reality, the plan is there to make life easier for the group home provider or whatever living facility the person it is. So it's not walking programs, it's not assessment or care plans, It's not the IT meeting, which I talked about earlier, where all the professionals sit around and talk about the individual and they're not a part of it. It's not the therapist reports. It's not how to make life easier for staff. Many supports coordinators are currently the facilitators, but there's another model out there. They facilitate the person-centered plan. The other model out there, and that is actually a Medicaid reimbursable service, is independent facilitation. I'm not going to spend too long on this. I think maybe your takeaway needs to be that independent facilitators are third-party individuals that are trained in how to conduct a person-centered planning meeting. We actually do this training at MI-DDI, and we train people in how to facilitate a plan, and we teach them all about the process. Now, the good thing about this, and one of the evidence-based practices that has come out of this, is that it gives people who utilize the service system an opportunity to have someone who is not being paid by the agency to run their person-centered planning meeting. So you can see where it gives them a different level of independence in this process. Independent facilitators are paid by the organization that represents them. Usually, like I said, it's a Medicaid reimbursable system. They should not be employees of that organization, however. They should be independent of that organization. They can be family members, not all the time. They should be people with disabilities. I think that's the ideal situation. We know a lot of people who have disabilities that are independent facilitators that have gone through the training, and they're in very high demand at the agencies that are profiling them because people with disabilities call upon them because they do bring a unique perspective to the process. Now, there are legal requirements within a person-centered plan that a supports coordinator or a case manager are required to complete so that it can be put into the formal plan at the agency. And so what an independent facilitator does is complete the plan with their notes and gives it to the support coordinator, who then puts it into the form that they're required to. So they meet all the legal requirements of the agency.
In our previous slides, we've looked at person-centered planning and independent facilitation, and now we're going to discuss self-determination. What is self-determination? Self-determination is an individual's ability to set goals, to create a meaningful life for oneself. And that comes from experiences and from making choices and living through those choices and then learning from what works for us and what doesn't work for us, right? So we have to take chances and sometimes try new things to create a new level of our life. And so self-determination is about empowerment. It's empowering individuals to create meaningful and purposeful lives for themselves. Self-determination is not a program, it is a process. The ultimate goal is for that individual to control their life and how they want to live their life, and to identify areas that they feel are important to them. If they want to have a job, that means getting a job. If they want to go back and get some training or education, they can do that. If they want to volunteer in their community, that's an option that they might want to explore. There are 5 critical elements in the literature regarding self-determination, and the first is freedom. Freedom is the ability to decide how you want to live your life, and we all want that, don't we? We don't want other people telling us what to do and how to live our life, what time to get up, what time to go to bed, what show we're going to watch on television, what we're going to do online. We want to be able to make our choices, and this starts with, where do we want to live? How do we want to connect every day in our lives with people in our community? It's the opportunity for us to engage our life, but also to contribute in our own ways. It's the development of a personal lifestyle. The second critical element is authority, and this regards over a targeted amount of dollars to purchase supports within the backing of our budgets and what we need. It's the authority to control resources. So it's not only our mental health dollars that we receive that dictate, what we have to spend on things, but it's also other resources. Do we have a job? Do we have other resources that are even non-monetary that we need to think about as we allocate resources to develop our goals. The third element of self-determination is support. And this is looking at ways to organize resources in ways that are life-enhancing and meaningful to a person. This means prioritizing our resources and dictating if we need staff and how many staff we will need to help us engage in an activity. Do we need natural supports or people that are unpaid staff that are in our lives, like neighbors and friends? It's the support that really helps an individual with an intellectual or developmental disability reach their life dream. The fourth critical element is responsibility, and this is the wise use of public dollars and the recognition of the contribution that individuals across disabilities and aging can make to their communities. This means we're responsible for knowing what our budget is, for examining our budget on a regular basis and seeing where our dollars are being spent. What activities, if we receive transportation, how much does that transportation cost us from our public dollars? Also, it does make good sense to understand and know what other disability populations are working with, and the aging population also uses a similar model as they need supports to live their lives fully in the communities. So sometimes meeting and joining these other groups and understanding what they do and what's working well can help make systemic changes as we create a sort of synergy in that process. The last critical element is confirmation. This is the important role that we play as individuals in the newly designed system, and the role we play for helping others replicate that system responsibly and teaching how other people can have self-determined lives.
Really, self-determination is so key. I can't stress enough how it's such an important process because it's one of those things that without it, it's one of the foundations, the building blocks, and it's very difficult to build like the person-centered planning process and the other practices that we use in the field without the self-determination. And so as future professionals, you're going to be learning some of these things and be kind of like cognizant of how can we help build people's confidence? How can we help them identify their strengths? How can we help them, attain goals and the confidence to attain those goals? And this moves me to natural supports. The term natural supports is a term that's not used very much out in the field anymore. What we are calling it now is like a circle of support, a circle of friends. And you've heard me talk about this throughout the community membership model lecture. And it's so integral to people's success. Ann and I will work on another project, the NCI project, and we do surveys with people, individuals who have disabilities. And several of the questions on this national survey get at how often you get out in the community. And what I've learned from doing the process is that people who aren't really supported by this circle of friends are really dependent on one or two people, like maybe providers, to get them to community events. And when that happens, it's very difficult for them to get out in the community and to participate in activities fully. And so this is where this idea of circle of supports or a circle of friends needs to be expanded on for that individual so that they can more fully participate in the things that they want to participate in. And this is where getting creative becomes very important, thinking a little bit outside the box. Who could be an individual that could support that person that's not a traditional provider, like a direct care worker, or maybe it's a neighbor next door, or maybe it's the college student who's age appropriate with that individual if it's a young person with a disability. And how do we link those people together? But the support system is so important so that people can actually access community and expand what what they're participating in their life. So a big part of all of this, right, are the family, the friends, and the community. Supports are a way to offer assistance to people with and without disabilities, and in the context of everyday places in their communities. Friends and allies allow a person to have less reliance on paid professional help, which is often unavailable and often goes away. And they are often the individual's preference over the formal, less familiar support offered by organizations. And we all need to be a lot more creative, I think, as we work in the field about thinking about that and how we can make that a reality for people. There's both paid and unpaid supports. Not everyone has a circle of friends, so we have to develop that circle of friends, sometimes from scratch for people. Developing and maintaining friendship is hard work, whether you have a disability or you don't have a disability, but one of the things that I hear most, whether it's from parents who have children who are very young to adults, is they don't get invited to things, they don't go to the birthday parties when the kids are little, they're not a part of it. As adults, they don't have interaction with other people who are in their age group, not doing the same activities that people their age are doing. And so this is where making this link, building this support, developing friendships is so key, because that is how people are going to participate, and their life is going to become fuller. And now think back to Uri Bronfenbrenner and that whole theory about mapping and systems theory, right? And the more your life is active, the more you're involved in, quality of life goes up, self-satisfaction goes up. So friendship is really important. And if you think about your own life, right, your friends are very valued by you. People with disabilities don't always have access to friendships. They were always in specialized programs. They may have lived in institutions. And they're really depending on that circle widening. And if you think to Greta, Greta's sister is part of her circle, but also that woman that works in the doctor's office. Now, she's a friend of Greta, okay? So we have to think about this as future professionals. And how do we create this type of environment and create friendships for people? So this is our summary on the community membership model. These are some of the problems that we're still experiencing in this paradigm. People with disabilities are often poor. We've been talking about that a lot here in the last few days. They're making under $15,000 a year. Someone in our office just conducted a literature review and found this fact. So you can imagine they're living in less than $15,000 a year. They're living below the poverty level. They need training in schools that will equal jobs, that will equal real money. We need to stop school segregation or work towards advocacy of that. Special education does not translate into jobs, and there's reams of research and literature on this. The unemployment rate for people with disabilities is still hovering around 75%, and it has been for 30 years. There's a shortage of direct care workers to help people with disabilities live their lives. Again, this is a very big problem, and we spend a lot of time talking about this in the field, but we don't have any hard and fast answers yet. We need to teach self-determination skills to children. Wherever you are in your professional career, if you're a student, think about this and how can we support children in this, and parents in this, and caregivers. And we need to take and let people take risks from the choices they make and learn from life, because usually that's how we learn better decisions. Remember back to that 1970 paper, right? Remember that one bullet from the advocates that stated they don't want to be coddled? So that's something we need to take to heart. This is some work we're working on currently in this model, but we need to do more work around. People with disabilities should be living in inclusive communities. There's legislation out there right now that we're working towards putting some teeth behind policy so that people can live in homes that they want to live in instead of living in group settings or living home with their families. People want to determine and should determine how their lives are lived. We need to continue to utilize person-centered planning and improve this process. as an important evidence-based practice, as it lays the groundwork, the whole map for a person's life. Self-determination, again, can't say enough about this. It's essential. It's an essential ingredient for all of us. We need to do a better job of asking the person what they want for themselves and not assuming what they want for themselves, both as family members, professionals, and wherever you're at. As a trainee, we need to think about what that person really wants and move forward with that. Continue to build circles of support. This is a challenge, and we need to continue to think about exemplary models that we can move towards to build friendships and to build community connections, which lead to opportunities for people. We need to check in and see what's working and not working, and continue to improve on what's working and let go of some of the old practices and things that are no longer working for people with disabilities and moving them forward. And in closing, community is essential to living a vibrant life. Communities mean including all members of that community, from our people with IDD to elders, to people with physical disabilities, mental health disabilities. And after all, it's important. It makes our lives richer, this interaction that we have with our diversity. I do have one last clip I'd like to show you in closing, and maybe you all can think about questions. Are there any other questions for anyone before I turn it over to Ann to kind of review the homework and for next week?
Yes, Ed has a question. Could you talk a little more about the individual's goals and priorities and the support team's concerns about safety? For example, an individual with motor impairments wanting to go to a less accessible home where safe evacuation may be a concern. What factors do you weigh?
That's an excellent question. It's something to consider. What other accommodations can we make? That's where we want to look at this. So is there a way we can have this individual living in this home that he really wants to live in? And how can we change and accommodate that person's disability so that they're still safe? So there's maybe many things that can be done. Maybe you contact UCP, and if it's a ramp issue, there are grant funds we can put in a ramp. If it's a question of, second floor availability, maybe we have a bedroom on the main floor, convert a study to a main floor. So we have to get creative here. We don't want to create a risky situation, but there's so many multiple accommodations we can make so that this person can live in a home that they want to live in, and so that everyone feels comfortable with that. I hope that helps answer the question. All right, well, I want to thank everybody. It was a great honor to be a part of the lecture series.